All right. Good morning, Dad. Today is Friday, January 10th. How you feeling?
Fine. I'm feeling fine. It's supposed
Okay.
to snow today. We're expecting several inches of snow in the little city in which we live. Rather an unusual event. Normally we don't see a lot of snow here.
Yeah, we're bracing for that. Okay, well, what's been on your mind other than the weather?
Um, well, the world, the world weighs heavily upon me. But in particular, I've been thinking about what's happened in Kursk recently. Um, there was an attack that took place. I think the proper term is a counterattack. I think it was described as an offensive by the Ukrainians themselves, but it really wasn't on that scale. It was a significant counterattack. They did throw quite a bit into it, but it was, we're talking about a couple dozen vehicles. It's not. It couldn't be described as an offensive, and um, yeah, there's simply no way to describe it as an offensive. But they clearly made a real attempt. They had prepared for this. Interesting. I think they've been preparing for it for a while, and but they didn't do a very good job of keeping their plans confidential. Because apparently, about 2 days before the counterattack, military bloggers in Spain were discussing it. It's going to happen on this at this time and in this way, and it was just as they said. So I don't know how that got, this information got leaked to them, but it was out there, and clearly the Russians knew that it was going to happen. They were completely prepared for it, and so it was. You have to say that it was just a total resounding failure for the Ukrainians. They attempted to punch. I think it was like northeast, and it's not clear why they were trying to do that because there really wasn't anything in that direction. There really isn't anything, in that area of Kursk anyway. But I think they managed to occupy part of a hamlet for about a day, and then the Russians drove them back with very significant losses. I mean, there are a lot of videos and photos out there of smoking hulks of armored vehicles. I think just like all of their vehicles were destroyed. They began the attack with, I guess it was a column of armored vehicles and a demining vehicle, and it was under a kind of a bell jar of EW, which was, it was not very extensive, but it was quite powerful, just in that limited area. The problem is that the Russians, actually somewhere around the start of the Kursk incursion, began using fiber optic drones, which are completely impervious to EW. And so, when they realized what was going on, they quickly switched over to their fiber optic drones and just started taking out these vehicles one after another. So you have to say it was a terrific failure. They made a real effort. I mean, there was the initial attack, and they tried to push in, other forces behind them, but it achieved nothing. They made a very small advance on the first day, and then by within 2 days they were back to where they started, and all they had to show for it were these very severe losses, and to give you an idea of how easy it was for the Russians to deal with this attack. While this was going on, just a few kilometers away, the Russians continued with their own offensive, and just like in the period of this counterattack, they took another 3-4 hamlets, closing, tightening the noose further in the Kursk region. So I think, if anything, it was a huge demonstration of Ukrainian weakness. I mean, it just seems, I think you can see from this that Ukraine really is on, maybe I shouldn't say its last legs, because it just seems like they always have a little something left. But they're clearly much weaker than they used to be. When we saw counterattacks like this maybe a year ago, they would achieve something. They'd be able to hold on to a village, for a week or 2 weeks, and then eventually the Russians would push them back. they just achieved nothing, and the Russians hardly seemed to even notice. I mean, again, the neighboring forces, they didn't have to shift any forces or anything. They continued with their own offensive.
So how damaging do you think this is to the Ukraine military, the regime?
Well, it's just part of, of the general disaster that has been the Kursk incursion. The whole thing, it never made military sense. It was, and they have lost a lot in this Kursk pocket, you could call it now, and they just won't give up. That the thing is, it's not. It really is a sideshow. It has no strategic significance. But they have been pouring their best forces, their best equipment into it. They're constantly reinforcing what they have there, and with more equipment, more their most experienced fighters. So it is, it's just part of this most recent counterattack is part of an ongoing disaster.
Right. I've heard that more equipment was lost in the Kursk region than all of the 2023 summer offensive. Is that true? Yeah. Do you know if that?
Well, that is Putin's claim, and I think it's probably true. I mean, there was actually I think it was a New York Times story a few months ago that admitted that the Ukrainians were losing armor at double the rate, losing armor in Kursk at double the rate that they were losing it in other places. And, I think that it has to be at least double the rate. And the reason is actually quite obvious. There's nothing very mysterious about that fact. They don't have the fortifications there. Remember, in the Donbass, they spent 10 years building up these fortress cities and these trenches and tunnels and underground bunkers and reinforced high rises that they have a lot of cities or large towns, large villages in Donbass where they can actually hide or assemble forces and prepare for attacks, but they don't have any of that. This is a very sparsely populated area. It's Russian territory. Obviously, the Ukrainians weren't there building up fortifications, so they're just out in the open, and it's actually been just sort of like a gift to the Russians. Yeah, there was that initial embarrassment. There's no question about it, but it's just been they're at a severe disadvantage. The Ukrainians are when they're fighting there. They're losing. They had their most secure fortifications in the Donbass, and some of those are still left. But the Russians have broken through. Let's say like 95 or maybe even more. 95% or maybe even more of those fortifications. Like I've said, they're coming to the very, very end of them. And after that, it becomes a little bit more like Kursk, in eastern Ukraine there.
The level of destruction of the equipment must be massive to be greater than that 2023 summer offensive, because that summer offensive was touted and they're not hiding behind, it's an offensive. They weren't hiding behind those fortifications like we said. Yeah. We saw them rolling over minefields, getting bogged down and just getting blown up.
Yeah.
And from what we've seen with Kursk almost seems like a sideshow in comparison to the 2023 offensive. But then you hear that actually more armor, more equipment was destroyed in Kursk, but we don't talk about it that much. It's not really...
Right. Well, if you follow the Telegram channels, you'll see every day there's something, there's always some little video. I usually don't waste my time watching it, but there's some video about a tank or a column of armored vehicles being wiped out in the Kursk area. Not just in Kursk, but just Sumy, where the launching area, the rear for Kursk. So the Russians have been striking both into Sumy and into Kursk, and it's just a daily thing. Again, it doesn't get all that much attention, but the numbers, keep on increasing. The wreckage keeps on piling up.
You said that this demonstrated Ukraine's weakness. Does Ukraine's weakness equate to NATO's weakness? Is that fair to say?
Yeah, well, you have to say it. I mean, it's okay. Um, it is NATO equipment now. I mean, all of this equipment that's being destroyed is NATO equipment. So that does show something. I think that, yeah, clearly NATO just doesn't have the equipment, the munitions to give uh, Ukraine that it did back in 2023. That was sort of the last hurrah. And that's when there was all this, kind of this. It was all spoken of with, great anticipation, great excitement. We're giving them, hey, now it's going to be Leopards and Challengers, the best that NATO has to offer. This is just they're going to break through those Russian lines and march to Azov, and soon they're going to be in Crimea. And there was all that talk. They were giving him a lot of equipment, an awful lot of equipment, and well, we know what happened then. That offensive was thoroughly defeated. But they don't even have that equipment now. They don't have nearly as much.
Right. The Leopard 2 tank, the Abrams tank, these were legendary tanks. I mean, I remember them, and just think like these are the baddest things out there. But then you see videos of them getting blown up by a $10,000 drone. So this has to be causing shockwaves to the military-industrial complex in terms of their ability to sell arms. If you're part of NATO, you're required to buy NATO equipment, overpriced, ineffective products. But the rest of the world, do you think that what kind of repercussions will this have on the MIC if all of a sudden when they go to the arms expos, people just say, yeah, I don't want those anymore. I've seen how they've been working in Kursk.
Yeah. No, it's a huge, actually, you're right. I mean, this is a huge issue because we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars. This is a huge industry, a very, very important industry for the U.S. As the U.S. has been, its industrial base has shrunk over the past few decades. We've gone from, we used to be a leader in many areas of industry, and now it's, maybe the one area of industry where we're still definitely a leader of some sorts, at least, when you look at the total price tags, is military equipment. So this is a huge issue. This is a matter, it's almost an existential issue for the U.S. and certainly for the MIC. And I think that probably explains a lot of the very tight narrative control. It's not just that the prestige of the U.S. is at stake, but a lot of the bottom line for a lot of businesses, for leading corporations in the United States, that too is at stake. And so again, I know it's one reason maybe why we're not seeing the news on destroyed armored vehicles and tanks and so forth in the Kursk region. I think there's probably a deliberate effort to suppress that kind of news.
You said it's existential potentially. So what do you think could be the fallout exactly if
maybe it's definitely existential for MIC. I might be overstating it a bit when you're talking about the U.S., but it's highly significant. It's more than highly significant. We're talking about probably the leading industry, and if it takes a severe blow, that is going to do serious damage to the U.S. economy.
Yeah, will it? In my mind, it would just sort of affect just a few people that are really lining their pockets. Would it really affect the everyday American economy, or could this be a good thing for if the MIC is exposed?
Yeah. I mean, if it was, of course, the people that make the most money off of it are the CEOs and the lobbyists and so forth, the Congress critters, but U.S. workers would be affected too. There's no question about it. There's actually a deliberate effort. There has long been a deliberate effort by the Pentagon to distribute, their largesse throughout the U.S. I think every state in the U.S. I can't remember. There's certain large systems. It might have been the F-35, or it may have been something else, in which it turned out that there were actually contracts in every one of the 50 states. And that was no accident. Essentially they were buying the support of congressmen around the country. And they do that by, something that the the local member of Congress can go to his people and say, yeah, thanks to my efforts, we're going to have this new factory here, or our factory is going to get these new orders, and we're going to add 100 workers, or and the numbers are probably not that great, but they do mean something.
Do you think if we see less purchases or less sales of arms to countries like Saudi Arabia throughout the global south, that the way that the military-industrial complex would to compensate that was just to build the U.S. government even more, so that way the same amount of money goes through and nothing really changes? You know what I mean? That almost feels like the game.
Yeah. Well, okay. Yeah. I mean, there are sales that are competitive, and those are like sales or semi-competitive. Let's say to sales to Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia does have a choice. I think Saudi Arabia is always, at least for the foreseeable future, is going to buy a fair amount from the U.S. because though it has moved away from the U.S., it still wants to kind of keep one foot in the U.S. camp. And so just for that reason, for political reasons, I think they're going to continue to buy arms from the U.S. But they do have options. And they've already started to exercise, that option. Like recently they bought, it was an air defense system from Russia, which they had never done before. And I think that's going to be part of a trend. So, some countries like Saudi Arabia are going to just kind of maybe split things and maybe get half their arms from the U.S., but the other half from Russia and maybe China or other countries. But some countries are just going to switch completely to, at least there's the potential for that. They're just going to say, hey, this is too expensive and it doesn't work. We're going to start buying from the Russians.
Right. Just a whole nother unraveling thread you can pull. You mentioned as well that this was leaked, the Kursk offensive was leaked 2 days before military bloggers. So first of all, if it was leaked and people were writing about it, it was clear that the Russians knew. Why did you think they went ahead and did it anyways?
I don't know.
If it was leaked? And are these leaks, are they becoming more and more prevalent?
I've only heard about it in this case. Like the Kursk incursion itself was a real surprise. I know there's this theory that the Russians might have known about it and laid a trap. I don't believe that for a number of reasons. It's not impossible, but I think they were taken by surprise. And so they had done, really quite a good job of keeping their preparation secret. I think one of the reasons that they succeeded with Kursk is that there had been a lot of talk that the Russians were maybe planning some kind of incursion in the area. And so, if a buildup of forces could have been defensive, and maybe that's how the Russians, interpreted it. But, that's one thing. Yeah, I can't explain why security was so bad in this most recent case. And I don't know if it's part of a trend or not. It may be that there's just kind of maybe growing dissent within the Ukrainian military. They're really frustrated with what's going on. And, they're starting to talk and complain.
Right. Yeah, something you mentioned was the use of fiber optic drones.
Right.
I saw this as well, and how they can completely evade any EW system because it has a direct link. And another advantage of these fiber optic drones, if you watch them, is that they have a very, very high frame rate. So the picture quality is very good.
Yeah.
It's not like with the other one. So it's like playing a flight simulator game. It's very, very accurate. But I'm wondering, why is it that we haven't seen the Ukrainians develop something similar? Because they've been using these fiber optic drones for a while. I don't think the technology is that advanced, but we haven't seen the Ukrainians try to counter it with something like that.
Yeah.
Do you use their own,
Yeah, I think we will see it. This is this conflict has seen both sides kind of go through multiple generations of drone technology. Drone technology has been evolving, rapidly throughout this conflict. And at the start, Ukraine was actually clearly in the lead. It was an area in which the Russians underinvested. And they really had very few drones to speak of, but then quickly discovered that, okay, this is the new weapon. This is a weapon that we must have in this 21st century conflict. And so they began to catch up, and now I think everyone acknowledges that the Russians have moved ahead. But the Ukrainians, that's one area where they've shown themselves to be quite resourceful. It's actually one area where they're not completely dependent on, NATO. They have a lot of small workshops distributed throughout the country, so it's difficult for the Russians to stop production of these drones. And they've shown themselves to be innovative. Again, they're falling behind the Russians, but I think it's inevitable that we'll see fiber optic drones on the Ukrainian side. I know that they're working on AI drones with the help of, I believe, Google, some major U.S. corporations. And those too can evade EW because they're not dependent on a signal from the ground. But my understanding is that the AI drones, the AI capability just kind of is activated in the final stage, in the terminal portion of the flight. And so for the first part of the flight, you still need a human operator, and you need a signal link to a ground base. And for the first part of the flight, it is vulnerable to EW. It's just at the very end when a target has been found that it can actually hone in on it, and it doesn't have to. It can do it, without any sort of signal link, and is therefore impervious to EW, or maybe, at least to EW as it is currently exists. Apparently, there are ways to counter this, though, because it's dependent on a visual image right at the end. That's what it's using to target. So one possible solution is to actually use a strobe light, to direct a strobe light at the drone, the AI drone, as it's approaching, and that confuses it. It prevents it from seeing the image, and it goes off course. So there are things, it's going to be this constant back and forth. One side develops a new technology, and the other side develops the technology to counter it. And that's what we've seen throughout this conflict, and I think that's something that we're going to continue to see.
War's getting scary, Dad. AI drones. See, This is the future. AI drones, hypersonic missiles, and the U.S. and NATO seem to be stuck in tanks and aircraft carriers.
Right.
And,
well, apparently tanks still have a place. I kind of have my doubts about it, but the Russians are still churning out a lot of tanks, and I think what they're doing. Well, I know this is what they're doing. They're trying to. They're modifying the tanks so that they can continue to function in this new battlefield. So you see they have those cope cages, right? That's something that, like a netting above the tank. That's, again, is to prevent to protect the tank from a drone that's striking from above.
Explode outside of the tank.
Right. And then also, I think they're equipping these tanks with EW units. So when a drone is spotted in the area, it directs a beam at the approaching drone. And then I think I also read somewhere, I'm not quite sure, but they're also maybe kind of reconfiguring the armor, because in the past, the concern was actually with maybe a shell that was being fired from another tank that was that had a horizontal, a path that was parallel to the ground, that was horizontal. But now these drones come down from the top, and there is sort of a weak spot on the top of the tank, and I think they're making some efforts to address that weakness. So, yeah, it seems to me like when you see these videos again and again of, again, like you say, a $10,000 drone destroying a $1 million tank or a multi-million-dollar tank, and you kind of wonder, does this really make sense? I have my doubts about it, but others argue, like people like Big Surge, who's a very astute military analyst. He says, no, the tanks are here to stay. We'll see.
I think one of the most damning things for the future of the U.S. MIC is this war has shown how the inability for the MIC to make adjustments and evolve in this war. We haven't been able. First of all, we can't scale up munition production, but also it seems like we're kind of stuck in just creating the same product over and over again, even though it doesn't work. We haven't seen really much of evolution in terms of NATO equipment. You just said yourself that the drone technology is really largely independent of the Ukrainians are being innovative on their own out of necessity. But the equipment that they're getting from NATO just doesn't seem to work, and NATO doesn't seem to be evolving yet. I've seen these armored columns, but I haven't seen something simple like the netting over the tanks. I haven't seen that on the NATO side. Why?
Right.
This isn't advanced stuff.
Yeah, I saw a photo recently, so I think there's just beginning to kind of trickle in. But I mean, they should be. I agree. I mean, it just seems like there's a lack of awareness. There should be growing alarm, but it's just something that, again, I think there's just this insufferable smugness on the Western side. The sense of superiority. And then, as we've said many times, we have this system that really isn't geared towards winning wars against a peer adversary. It's geared towards lining the pockets of a lot of well-connected people in the West. And again, they're so comfortable with that system that I don't see it changing in any significant way for quite a while. I mean, it should be changing now, but I think the crisis isn't big enough for any real changes.
Okay, we'll sit and monitor. Okay, I'll switch topics a bit. Something that I've been thinking about a little bit is I saw the news that the Georgian ex-president Salome Zorabachvili, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. She's now taken up a fellowship at Arizona State University. I don't know if you saw that. But then
I think it's actually at the McCain Institute.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
But what I thought was kind of interesting about this, though, is that we saw Victoria Nuland became, a fellow at Columbia University alongside Hillary Clinton is there. And I'm wondering, is there just some type of, is this proof that the university system in the United States is almost like an extension of the State Department? With State Department officials that don't succeed, they get sent. And now I'm looking at universities differently now. I'm like, wait, what is this? I thought this was a place where we're just supposed to learn and question things. And now I'm like...
Right. Yeah. Well, I remember, there was a very popular bumper sticker when I was young. I saw it all over Berkeley, and that was question authority. And, even back then, it was, I think at least... it wasn't clear that, like the Berkeley types were really questioning authority. It was just certain types of authorities. It was old authority, and they could be very, very obedient to new authority. But that's a whole separate issue. But quite certainly when I was young, universities were considered hotbeds of dissent. And that was true, I think, like up even, through the 90s. Certainly, like the anti-war movement was kind of grew out of the universities. There was real opposition to, there was opposition to like CIA recruitment efforts on university campuses and that kind of thing. The CIA was not welcome, and I think what you're pointing to shows that that's all changed. It's just like now, the academy, the universities and the larger establishment, let's say the government and corporations as well, they're all one. They think with one mind. It's the same people that move back and forth between them. No longer are these universities islands of dissent. They're just sort of tools of the establishment. And I think that's it's a consequence of what Antonio Gramsci, he was a Marxist thinker, an Italian Marxist thinker, called the long march through the institutions. That is that, he said that he proposed like the way to carry out the revolution was not through, an armed insurrection, but rather through taking over various leading institutions within a country. And that's what happened. So the left began this long march back in the 60s. And, since then, they really have transformed the country. Now, in the same time, they've transformed themselves, I think, in a way, because it's not the same left that I remember when I was young. Maybe it's just what happens. Like when you take control of the reins of power, you can take control, for example, of the Pentagon. Then you stop being against wars because they're your wars. It's your military power. It used to be, it was those old, the military power belonged to the old fogies. And, so we hate the military. Now that it's our military, we love it and don't you dare criticize it. I think that's what you're seeing.
Can these institutions be saved, or are they just lost?
Well, I've heard people propose, like on the dissident right, that we got to start our own long march. And I suppose that could happen. I just don't see any signs of that happening, to be honest. It takes more than a few individuals. It has to be a whole generation. And, that's what you had in the 60s, a whole generation. They adopted this new ideology, and then went on to become professors and to become, State Department employees and to work for leading law firms, and eventually, through this change of generations, those places were transformed.
Have we seen this as kind of a cycle? Have these institutions previously, like Harvard or whatever, that they've gone through and become corrupted and then got fixed, cleaned up, and then become corrupted again? Or are we in a unique phase where these institutions are all captured?
It's a history I don't know well enough to give a real definitive answer. But, there's no question that there was, let's say, in the 50s and earlier, there was less friction between the universities and leading institutions of the country. It was in the 60s that the universities first became radicalized, and they became the hotbeds of dissent. I think there was, they had a reputation for being, providing sanctuary to dissenting thinkers, but it just wasn't on the scale that you saw in the 60s beforehand. It's just something that I'd have to look at more closely to give you a real definitive answer.
Okay. Well, we can move over to the Middle East real quick then. So there were presidential elections in Lebanon. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Actually, it was a presidential election, and by the Constitution of Lebanon, the president has to be Christian. Lebanon is a multi-confessional society. There are Shia, there are Sunnis, there are Jews, there are Christians. And they worked out, all these different groups just worked out the system where, different offices were reserved for different sects. The president is supposed to be Christian. Now, the president is not supposed to be the head of the military, but the man who won the election, was Joseph Aoun, was and is, in fact, the head of the military. So that's unconstitutional, but it doesn't seem to be bothering anyone. Now, just as some background to this, this was actually a fact that I wasn't aware of, but I learned this from Craig Murray, that 50% of all the salaries that are paid to members of the Lebanese armed forces, we're not talking about Hezbollah, we're talking about the official government forces, 50% is paid by the U.S. So, you wonder, like, every time that Israel attacks or invades Lebanon, you wonder why the Lebanese army is just standing on the sidelines, twiddling their thumbs and not doing anything. And Hezbollah is doing all the fighting, defending Lebanon. Well, I think you got a big part of your answer right there. Clearly the U.S. exerts tremendous control over the Lebanese armed forces. And this Joseph Aoun was pretty much picked by the Americans. The Americans said, we want you to vote for him. I mean, they sent their emissary to the Middle East, Hochstein, who's also, I think, an Israeli citizen, by the way. And he told everybody in the Lebanese parliament, we want you to vote for this man. And the French sent their own emissary, and they said the same thing, we want you to vote for this man. He didn't succeed on the first vote, but my understanding is that he did get elected on a subsequent vote. But there was also, there wasn't just the fact of this obvious, well, the influence that I described goes even farther. The Americans made it clear to the Lebanese parliament and said that if the only way the Israelis are going to withdraw from southern Lebanon is if you vote for him. Otherwise, they won't. Again, this is democracy, American style. I mean, this is just sort of like putting a gun to the head of another country and telling them, okay, this is how we want you to vote. And we've seen similar things, of course, like in Venezuela and so forth. I think it's very shameful, but it's what was done.
Yeah, I saw a tweet from Anthony Blinken congratulating Aoun and saying how he's looking forward to working with them. And I immediately thought, like, well, something's not right here,
Right.
So what do you think this means then for Hezbollah, the end of the ceasefire, the future of Lebanon?
Yeah, well, I don't know. Like I say, I think in the last program, I said that Hezbollah has proven itself to be just a very resilient organization. And I think it would always be a mistake to count them out. I think people have done that in the past, and they've always come back. They are facing long odds now, or we should say at least, some very challenging circumstances. But though their leadership was wiped out, their organization is still there, and it has very, very strong support from much of the Lebanese population, not just the Shias. They've shown themselves to be like one of the few organizations that really, deliver services to the population and that have defended Lebanon repeatedly. I imagine that many, many Lebanese just feel nothing but contempt for the Lebanese armed forces, but they do respect Hezbollah. So again, they're in a difficult place because of the fall of Syria. I really worry for the future, but we'll just have to see. I think, again, we're going to see a renewal of the fighting in like 2 or 3 weeks when that truce, which Israel constantly violated, comes to an end. I think we've signals from both sides indicate that the fighting is going to renew, and we'll see how they do. Israel's position is clearly stronger this time around, but Hezbollah put up very, very stiff resistance. Israel just was not able to make any kind of significant progress. We'll see if they can this time.
Have we heard anything from Iran?
Let me see. I haven't heard anything new. The big event that we should be looking to is the visit of Pezeshkian to Moscow, which is upcoming. Actually, on January 17th, Pezeshkian and Putin are going to sign a very comprehensive agreement between Iran and Russia. And I think that's quite a significant event.
Okay. Interesting. On the last episode, I showed you that video of Jeffrey Sachs, the one that Trump retweeted on Truth Social.
Yeah.
And in that video, he just straight up says that Netanyahu got us into the Iraq war, that this was Netanyahu's war. Is that really true? And if that is true, how so? How did he do that?
Yeah, I know that actually Mearsheimer and Waltz, in their Israel Lobby book, I read that quite a few years ago, but it made quite a splash at the time. They argue that in fact it was true. It was it wasn't just Netanyahu, but it was the Israel Lobby that played a decisive role in pushing us into war with Iraq. Because again, we really didn't have any reason to go to war with Iraq. And in fact, I think if you're looking purely in terms of American interests, it was against our interests to attack Iraq. If we're going to consider Iran the main enemy, I don't think that's necessary either. But we just have. That's been true ever since the fall of the Shah. Um, well, it just makes sense to prop up Iraq. Um, and because Iraq was of course went to war against Iran, Iran's main regional rival. So why would you want to take out Iraq? It doesn't really make sense from an American perspective, and it turned out to be disastrous. From that American perspective, because after the Iraqi government fell, Iranian influence in Iraq increased, 100-fold, or, it went from zero to actually to being very extensive because there's a very large Shia population in Iraq. So, yeah, it just doesn't, and, it's more than that. It's just that you can point to the obvious efforts made by Israel itself, and then Israeli-aligned officials, people that with dual U.S.-Israeli citizenship that were high up in the U.S. government, people like Wolfowitz and was it Perth? I'm probably mispronouncing his name, but there were many individuals that played a crucial role in pressuring the U.S. government to launch its disastrous war against Iraq. Many Israeli-linked officials.
It's amazing to me how we can just get away with it. How our AIPAC can just get away with this. Yeah. That they can start a war, destroy millions of lives, use our militaries, cost the U.S. trillions of dollars, and there's no repercussions for anybody. It seems like they all get promoted.
No, it was a total disaster on just the Iraq war. No matter how you look at it, as you look at the loss of life within Iraq, the strategic consequences for the U.S., the loss of life among American soldiers, the tremendous cost to the U.S., it was just a total disaster. And there are some repercussions, clearly, but but not enough, not nearly enough. I agree.
Is there awareness within the U.S. military how stupid this was and how we were just used by AIPAC and the Israel lobby? Because you think you would. I mean, there's nothing that could be more infuriating for a soldier to say that I'm being lied to fight for an evil cause by some other foreign power. That, it just...
Unfortunately, I haven't, I just don't think there really are any dissenters. There used to be. In the U.S. military, but I think they have been weeded out, and it's the careerists, the people who they understand, which way the policy winds are blowing, and they act and speak and think accordingly. Now, among the rank and file, the actual soldiers, I've learned that it seems like you'll find more real dissenters to U.S. imperial policy among U.S. Army veterans than you will probably among any other group, because a lot of them went over there and say, hey, that's not what I was told. They see it with their own eyes, and so they just stop believing what they were told. And I've met people like that. I think they're not very uncommon. But those people, unfortunately, just don't seem to rise to the top within the military.
Right. I mean, we're playing with these people's lives. I think about those soldiers that are U.S. soldiers that are in these bases in Iraq and Syria illegally. I think they understand that they're illegally, and they just got to be wondering, what are we doing here exactly?
And some of them are,
right? And just the danger that they're being put in unnecessarily. Do you think that it would start to break through to some of them that are we doing this all just because Israel wants to sacrifice our lives for their cause? And
well, to some of them, and there is, I think it's still really very much a fringe movement, but let's say the anti-Zionist movement, or whatever you want to call it, is growing. It's it's taking different forms on the left and the right, and it's gone farther on the left because of Gaza, but you see it one thing is just. I always see these memes every time there's a disaster in the U.S. The most recent one being the fires in Los Angeles. There's always memes about sending money to Ukraine. And I think, like in the case, actually, I think the LA Fire Department donated um, equipment to Ukraine. And just one thing, it's highlighted by a lot of people who are sick of it. Are sick of the imperial policy that seems to put the interests of everything but Americans in their own communities first.
Mm, right. I know there's just been a lots of Trump talk, and we've talked about him on your views on his ability to wrap up the Ukraine war, and also the almost what you've expressed as almost a guaranteed clash with Iran. But when I listen to shows like Judging Freedom recently,
Yeah.
I've been getting a little bit of hopium
Yeah.
that Trump may be able to resolve this. More so, I feel, with the Ukraine conflict, that he is trying to put the blame on Biden. I'm wondering if you're reassessing your position with Trump and Ukraine, that he might actually be able to pull this off and get a deal. Because we were saying no deal because the political fallout is going to be going to be a lot for Trump. Everybody's going to say that it fell on his watch, and all the media is going to be against him. But also, more importantly, perhaps, is that the Russians don't trust the Americans at all anymore. Do you
Right.
still believe that this is the case, or do you think that
I
Trump
think
can make
that
something happen?
I'm going to remain the hardcore cynic. I've noticed even Mark Sloboda, who describes himself as a professional cynic, he almost with embarrassment expressed that he was starting to feel a little bit of hope. But I'm going to remain the hardcore cynic on this. I just don't see how any sort of negotiated settlement is going to come about. And for all the reasons that we've given before. And, one of them is, just as you just mentioned, is that the Russians, how can, even if, like, Trump makes them a real offer, a good one, how can they believe it? They've seen that the West and the Americans in particular break agreements left and right. It's something that they've experienced directly. They've seen Iran experience. How can they believe him? But I don't think he can even do it, because the thing is that any agreement that the Russians could accept would be one that would acknowledge NATO defeat. And I don't think it's, even if Trump were willing to do that, and I'm not at all sure that he is. It just the forces, that it's just all of NATO, all of the deep state are just going to be are going to fight against that tooth and nail. It's just not going to happen. They just can't let that happen. And it's the political cost of him trying to do that, or of actually doing that, is just going to be too huge. I don't think there's any chance. I really don't.
You don't think that Trump can just get in front of the American people? I mean, one thing that he's good at is he loves to talk, and he's got a big megaphone. And so couldn't he just explain, or have people maybe like RFK Jr. help explain the
I would love
conflict and
to
address
I just haven't. I just remember the first term of Trump, and the thing is that I just remember all the disappointments. Now, I know there are reasons to think that maybe he's learned lessons, and he does have some better people around him. But I refuse to believe in Trump. I know he says things that are very true, and he'll put things out there that are, are, let's say, heretical, again, by by all the rules of the deep state, and that's exciting. But I don't think he has the ability. I'm just speaking about his own personality, his own character, his intellect. I don't think he is capable of really carrying it through. I wish it were true, and I really will be happy to be proved wrong on this. If he could do what you're saying, I don't think he can. I don't think he will. I think he'll continue to kind of, he'll say everything under the sun. He'll say a lot of good things. I think he probably really does have an intention to negotiate a settlement with Putin. He doesn't want the war to go on, but then he'll probably start talking about bombing Moscow again at some point. I mean, it's just a lot of crazy things come out of this man's mouth. I mean, some of it's good. I will say it's not, it's good, but then look, seems to be really serious about making Canada the 51st state. I mean, this is really silly stuff. How can you take this man seriously? I just can't take him seriously. I know I feel like people are tempted to, want to. And I hope I'm wrong and that he's actually playing some sort of, I don't know, very clever game here, but I don't think so. I think, what we're looking at, all this mess is just kind of a reflection of a very messy mind. And I don't think he has the ability to focus and carry through and really, change the narrative on this. He'll punch holes in it. It's good. Just the fact that he says these things, I admit, is good. And it does get some, those thoughts out there. And maybe in the long run, he's sowing seeds for a revolution down the road. But I don't think he's the man to do it.
Okay, well, maybe he can't get a negotiated settlement, but couldn't he just walk away from the whole thing? I mean, isn't that an option? Just say, okay, this is, Ukraine isn't part of our sphere of influence. We're just out. This is, Europe. He's going to leave it on Europe to see what the EU does, but say NATO. This is, this is our fight.
Right. Well, the problem, I don't think he can do that. I mean, technically he could. Yeah, the negotiated settlement, I believe, is impossible because you're going to, again, the NATO and Russia are just too far apart, and then you have the crazy Ukrainians in between. Now, technically, that's something that he could do, and he would get some support from it, within his own party. The problem is, again, that if he does it, and then, inevitably there will be a true and collapse on such a scale that, it can't be hidden. To a great extent, the media are, hiding the collapse that is beginning to occur in Ukraine. But if he really pulls the plug, we'll see the Russians marching to the Dnieper, crossing the Dnieper, and that will all be put on him. And they'll say, "Look what he did. This is worse than Afghanistan. This is he's damaged U.S. prestige forever. This is a total disaster. He's weak. All those things will come out. And I don't think he can afford to risk that. So I think we're going to see him continue, even maybe against his better instincts, but that he will continue to supply arms to Ukraine. There may be just like some delays and whatever. In the end, it almost seems like it doesn't really matter because we just don't have that much to give them. In a lot of people's minds, it's like we've been showing restraint. We haven't. We've been just throwing them everything we have, and it obviously isn't helping. So, pulling the plug, is it going to make it? Well, it'll just accelerate, the fall. But even if we continue to supply arms, we can't stop the inevitable, which is a Russian victory.
Okay, well, I'm going to remain slightly optimistic.
Okay. Fair enough.
I don't know. Yeah, I listen to these guests on Judging Freedom and other shows, and sometimes I'm like, they make some compelling points, and I can see a little bit of hopium. Yeah, and I just want to be a little bit more optimistic. I don't want to get too down.
Well, they may be right. I mean, I know there are a lot of. I mean, these are smart people, and they just may be right, but I just don't see it. And sometimes I find myself hoping against hope that but then I stop and think about it, and for the reasons that I've given, I just don't see it happening.
Okay, well, we'll find out.
Okay, yeah.
I think we'll find out. Would you say that we would probably know within the first 100 days of his presidency, whether this is going to happen?
Right. If there's going to be some really meaningful development, it should happen within the first 100 days. I don't think we can count on a solution, like an end to the fighting, but if we don't see a breakthrough of some sort within the first 100 days, I don't think we're going to see anything.
Mm-hmm. Okay, last question. Well, what do you think about Trump's talks about acquiring Greenland? Canada, I think, is just whatever, silly. But the Greenland thing, it sounds so ridiculous, but then you go back and you think about purchase of Alaska, Louisiana purchase. There is precedent for large land purchases. There's hardly anybody living there. From my understanding, Greenland does have a fair amount of independence, actually, talks. It's not.
Yeah, there's an
completely controlled
independence
by-
movement there too. That of course Greenland belongs to Denmark. Has belonged to Denmark for centuries.
I think kind of like semi belongs, from what I understand. There was some kind of I don't know. I was looking it up. I forget. In like
yeah, I don't know the
2009, they
details.
have some kind of
Right.
They rely on Denmark for like foreign affairs and defense or something like this, but they do have some autonomy. You have to look it up yourself to check. But.
Right. It's not okay. Yeah, Canada is just absurd. That's not going to happen. As somebody pointed out too, it'd probably be a disaster for the Republican Party because Canadians would almost definitely vote for the Democrats. So it would actually bolster the Democrats within the U.S. That's just not going to happen. The Greenland thing is not quite so absurd. I'm very, very doubtful that it will happen, but it's not impossible. But a question comes to mind is why. I've heard people argue that this is very clever. It's about extending spheres of influence within the U.S. But not within the U.S., but within North America. But we already have our sphere of influence already extends over Greenland and Canada. I mean, we have. Again, these are Denmark and Canada are members of NATO, and don't tell me that the U.S. ever has any problems, like establishing some sort of military installation within Canada, for example, or Greenland. I mean, it's just I don't see how in the end it would really make much of a difference. Clearly our influence extends there, and how would that change things significantly? It would be an administrative change, but as far as national security, as far as the NATO alliance, I don't think it would change anything in any meaningful way.
Maybe it's just Trump's real estate mogul instincts kicking in. Just like,
you
look
may
at all
be
that
right.
land.
You may be right. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, well, I think we can end it there unless there's anything else you'd like to add.
No, we can end it there. That's not a problem.
All right, sounds good. Okay, have a good day and a great weekend, Dad.
You too.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.